Avoidant regret does not arrive loudly. It does not announce itself with dramatic emotion or obvious pain. It settles quietly, often long after the moment has passed, when the mind is no longer distracted by urgency. It is the subtle realization that you did not stand fully in yourself when it mattered. You chose departure instead of expression, distance instead of confrontation, and restraint instead of risk. At the time, this felt like control. Silence appeared mature, composed, even wise. Yet beneath that calm decision, something essential remained unfinished. The inner self does not measure strength by how well conflict is avoided, but by how honestly truth is lived. When you leave without speaking what needed to be spoken, the experience does not end. It relocates. The conversation you avoided externally begins to repeat internally. Thoughts circle back, not to reopen wounds, but to seek completion. Avoidant regret is born from this repetition. It is not about the other person or the situation alone. It is about the fracture between what you felt and what you allowed yourself to express. The psyche senses this fracture and quietly records it, waiting for awareness to catch up. Silence carries power only when it is conscious. When silence is chosen from clarity, it becomes grounding. When it is chosen from fear, it becomes a container for unresolved emotion. Avoidant regret grows when silence is used to escape discomfort rather than to honor inner truth. The mind later questions the decision not because leaving was wrong, but because the self was not fully present in the act of leaving. What lingers is not the absence of the other, but the absence of self-assertion. This is why regret often appears as self-doubt rather than longing. The inner voice asks whether silence was dignity or self-betrayal. Healing begins when this question is faced without judgment. Growth does not demand that you return to the past or rewrite the moment. It asks only that you understand it. When you recognize why you chose silence, you reclaim authorship over your inner narrative. Then silence becomes a deliberate boundary rather than an unconscious retreat. In that awareness, regret loosens its grip, not because the past changes, but because the self is no longer divided. Silence often feels like protection. In moments of emotional weight, withdrawing appears safer than risking conflict or vulnerability. You convince yourself that leaving without explanation preserves balance, that restraint proves strength, and that time will dissolve what words might only inflame. Yet this form of silence is rarely empty. It carries unspoken reactions, withheld boundaries, and emotions that were never allowed to take shape. The psyche does not discard these experiences. It stores them. What was not expressed externally begins to live internally, repeating itself in memory and imagination. This is where avoidant regret begins, not as pain over what was lost, but as discomfort over what was never honored within yourself. The regret is subtle. It appears as second-guessing, as quiet irritation, or as a vague sense that something about your departure lacked integrity. You may not miss the situation, but you miss the version of yourself who could have spoken clearly and remained grounded in truth. Silence protected you from immediate discomfort, but it also delayed self-recognition. Over time, the inner world demands resolution. The mind revisits the moment, not to reopen conflict, but to understand it. You replay conversations, imagine alternative responses, and sense a tension between who you were and who you could have been. This is not weakness, it is the psyche seeking integration. Avoidant regret teaches that peace built on suppression is unstable. True calm emerges when silence is chosen consciously, not reflexively. When you understand why you remained quiet, you begin to separate wisdom from fear. Growth does not require confrontation in every situation, nor does it condemn leaving. It asks only that your actions align with your inner reality. When silence becomes intentional rather than avoidant, it no longer produces regret. It becomes a boundary, not an escape. In this awareness, the past loses its charge. You no longer judge yourself for leaving because you understand yourself. The power of silence is restored when it serves clarity, not concealment, and the self becomes whole again, not by speaking louder, but by living more honestly. Leaving without resistance often feels like the cleanest solution. There is no raised voice, no visible rupture, no moment that can later be pointed to as a mistake. You walk away quietly and tell yourself that restraint was necessary, that engagement would have lowered you, that silence preserved your inner order. Yet the psyche measures events differently than the conscious mind. It does not ask whether the exit was calm, but whether it was truthful. Avoidant regret emerges when the self recognizes that something essential was withheld in the name of peace. The regret is not dramatic, it is reflective. It surfaces when you realize that by not standing your ground, you also did not fully inhabit yourself. The unspoken words did not vanish, they became internal pressure. What you refused to confront outwardly became a recurring inner dialogue. The mind returns to the moment, not because it longs for conflict, but because it seeks coherence. Avoidant regret is the signal that a part of you was left behind in the act of leaving. This regret does not mean you should have stayed or fought harder. It means the silence you chose was incomplete. Silence has value only when it contains awareness. When silence is automatic, driven by discomfort or fear of exposure, it fragments the inner world. The psyche then attempts to repair this fracture by revisiting the experience, asking questions you once avoided. These questions are not punishments, they are invitations to maturity. They ask whether your departure aligned with your inner truth or merely protected you from tension. Healing begins when you stop justifying the silence and start understanding it. When you recognize the motive behind your withdrawal, you reclaim agency over the past. The moment no longer defines you as someone who fled, but as someone who learned. Avoidant regret dissolves not through confrontation with others, but through reconciliation with yourself. When silence becomes conscious, it no longer carries regret. It becomes a deliberate act, grounded in self-respect, and the inner voice finally grows quiet, not because it was suppressed, but because it was heard. Avoidant regret deepens when the mind begins to realize that silence was not only an absence of words, but an absence of self-assertion. In the moment of withdrawal, you may have believed you were choosing the higher path, refusing to engage in conflict that felt unproductive or unsafe. Yet over time, a quiet awareness forms that something vital was left unresolved. This awareness does not accuse, it observes. It notices that while the situation ended, the emotional charge did not. What remains is a sense that your inner boundaries were never fully defined or honored. The psyche experiences this as incompleteness. It is not the departure that troubles you, but the lack of inner clarity that accompanied it. You begin to sense that silence, rather than closing the chapter, left it unfinished. The mind returns to the moment, not out of longing, but out of a need to restore internal balance and self-coherence. As this awareness grows, silence itself takes on a different meaning. You begin to see that not all silence is equal. There is silence that arises from grounded presence, and there is silence that emerges from avoidance. The regret you feel is a guide, pointing toward this distinction. It asks you to examine whether your quietness was chosen freely or imposed by fear of disruption. Growth occurs when you allow this question without defensiveness. You do not need to condemn yourself or dramatize the past. You need only to integrate the lesson it offers. When silence is understood, it becomes intentional rather than reactive. It no longer hides unresolved emotion, but contains it with awareness. In this integration, regret softens. The psyche no longer replays the moment because it has been internally completed. What once felt like a failure of courage becomes a source of insight. You learn that inner peace is not maintained by retreat alone, but by alignment between action and inner truth. Avoidant regret often reveals itself through the tension between calm behavior and restless inner life. Outwardly, you appeared composed. You did not argue, demand, or insist on being understood. You chose restraint, believing that stepping away would preserve your stability. Yet inwardly, a different process began. The self noticed that composure had been achieved by omission. Feelings were contained, but they were not resolved. This is where regret quietly takes root. It is not rooted in the belief that you should have won or prevailed, but in the realization that you did not fully represent yourself. The psyche seeks wholeness, and when expression is withheld, it compensates through repetition. Thoughts revisit the moment, not to inflame emotion, but to reclaim authenticity. Avoidant regret is the discomfort of knowing that silence protected your surface while leaving your depth unacknowledged. With time, this regret sharpens awareness rather than pain. You begin to understand that restraint without reflection becomes self-erasure. Silence is not harmful in itself. It becomes harmful when it denies your inner reality. Growth begins when you recognize that your quiet exit was a strategy, not an identity. This recognition restores choice. You no longer define yourself as someone who avoids, but as someone who learned the cost of avoidance. The mind gradually releases its grip on the past once it understands why the silence occurred. The lesson integrates into character, shaping future moments with greater clarity. Silence then transforms into a conscious boundary rather than a reflexive escape. In this state, regret loses its intensity because it has fulfilled its function. It has taught you the difference between peace that is maintained and peace that is earned. When action and inner truth align, silence becomes powerful again, not because it conceals, but because it reflects self-respect. Avoidant regret is closely tied to the moment when you realize that leaving did not bring the relief you expected. You anticipated that distance would quiet your thoughts and dissolve emotional tension. Instead, silence created space for reflection, and within that space, unanswered questions began to surface. You notice that the mind keeps returning to what was never clarified. This repetition is not a flaw in your thinking, it is the psyche's attempt to restore balance. When you withdraw without fully acknowledging your inner response, the experience remains incomplete. The self senses that a part of its reality was bypassed. Avoidant regret arises as a signal, not to shame you, but to draw attention to the gap between action and inner truth. It is the awareness that peace achieved through avoidance is fragile, because it relies on suppression rather than understanding. As this awareness deepens, the role of silence becomes clearer. Silence can be grounding, but only when it is inhabited consciously. When silence is used to escape discomfort, it stores unresolved emotion rather than releasing it. Over time, this stored tension seeks expression through reflection and self-questioning. Growth occurs when you allow this process without resistance. You begin to see that regret is not demanding confrontation with the past, but integration of its meaning. When you understand why you chose silence, you reclaim ownership of the moment. The psyche no longer needs to replay it, because it has been internally completed. In this completion, silence regains its dignity. It becomes a choice aligned with self-respect rather than a reaction driven by fear. Avoidant regret fades, not because the past is erased, but because the self is no longer divided by it. Avoidant regret often becomes visible when you notice how frequently the mind returns to the moment you chose not to speak. At first, you may believe these thoughts are simply habits or unnecessary self-criticism. yet beneath them lies a deeper psychological movement. The inner self is not replaying the past to punish you, but to complete what was left unfinished. When you walked away without expressing your inner position, the experience remained open within you. Silence ended the external situation, but internally it suspended resolution. This creates a quiet tension between who you were in that moment and who you sense you could have been. The regret does not arise because silence was wrong, but because it was incomplete. Something essential about your inner stance was never acknowledged, and the psyche seeks wholeness by revisiting it. Avoidant regret is the mind's way of asking for alignment, not confrontation. As awareness grows, you begin to understand that inner peace cannot be maintained by departure alone. True peace requires that actions reflect inner reality. When silence is chosen without this alignment, it becomes a form of self-abandonment. The regret that follows is subtle but persistent, guiding you toward greater self-honesty. Growth occurs when you stop resisting this guidance and listen to what it reveals. You do not need to correct the past or justify your silence. You need only to understand it. In doing so, you integrate the experience rather than remain divided by it. Silence then regains its power, no longer as avoidance, but as conscious presence. It becomes an expression of inner clarity rather than a retreat from discomfort. In this integration, avoidant regret dissolves naturally, having fulfilled its role as a teacher. The self no longer replays the moment because it has been inwardly completed. True inner peace does not come from the absence of conflict, but from the absence of inner contradiction. Avoidant regret arises when you recognize that silence allowed harmony on the surface, while disorder continued beneath. You left without resistance, believing that disengagement would protect your balance. Yet over time, the self begins to sense that balance was achieved at a cost. The cost was not the relationship, the situation, or the outcome, but the experience of standing fully in your own truth. The psyche does not demand constant expression, but it requires authenticity. When silence replaces authenticity, the inner world becomes divided. One part understands why you left, while another quietly questions why you did not speak. This division creates a low but persistent tension. Avoidant regret is not emotional chaos. It is quiet misalignment. It shows itself in reflection, in subtle dissatisfaction, in the feeling that something about the ending lacked integrity. The mind returns to the moment, not because it longs to change it, but because it seeks to understand the self that acted within it. As this understanding develops, regret shifts from discomfort into insight. You begin to see that silence itself was not the problem. The problem was unconscious silence. Silence chosen without awareness becomes avoidance. Silence chosen with clarity becomes strength. Growth occurs when you allow yourself to examine the motive behind your quiet exit without self-judgment. This examination completes what was left unfinished. You integrate the experience rather than suppress it. The psyche no longer needs to replay the moment because its meaning has been absorbed. In this integration, silence regains its rightful power. It becomes an expression of self-respect rather than a retreat from difficulty. Avoidant regret fades when the self understands itself. The past no longer asks to be revisited because it has been inwardly resolved. What remains is not guilt or longing, but clarity. You learn that true peace is not found in leaving quietly, but in leaving consciously, with inner truth intact. Avoidant regret becomes most apparent when the self notices the subtle ways it has been divided by unspoken truths. When you chose to leave without confrontation, you may have believed that the decision preserved dignity, balance, and composure. On the surface, this is true. You avoided immediate conflict, and the situation ended without visible disruption. Yet the psyche does not measure resolution by outward calm. It measures it by inner alignment. When words remain unsaid, when feelings are contained rather than expressed, the inner world experiences incompletion. Avoidant regret arises from this incompletion. It is not a punishment, it is a signal, a gentle reminder that the self craves coherence. You may feel it as a quiet tug, a lingering question, or repeated reflection on what might have been expressed. The mind returns not to reopen conflict, but to restore balance between action and inner truth. What you left unspoken lives within, creating tension until it is consciously addressed, understood, or integrated. This recognition transforms how you view silence. Silence itself is neither good nor bad. Its value depends on intention. Conscious silence, chosen from clarity and self-awareness, can be restorative, protective, and even empowering. Unconscious silence, chosen from avoidance or fear, creates internal friction and allows regret to grow. Avoidant regret guides you toward discernment. It asks you to examine the motive behind your quiet departure without judgment. It is not a call to retroactively engage or argue, but an invitation to understand why you acted as you did. When this understanding occurs, the experience is integrated rather than fragmented. The psyche no longer replays the moment because it has found completion within. Silence regains its rightful power, not as a tool for escape, but as a deliberate and conscious act that reflects self-respect. Avoidant regret fades not because the external circumstances change, but because the inner self has reconciled with the choice. In this reconciliation, peace emerges naturally. The act of leaving becomes neither shameful nor hollow. It becomes aligned with your truth. The self experiences cohesion, and what was once a source of quiet tension transforms into insight and clarity. You learn that the power of silence lies not in avoidance, but in conscious engagement with your own inner reality, allowing departures to be acts of integrity rather than acts of evasion. Avoidant regret becomes most evident when you reflect on the moments you chose absence over expression. At the time, leaving without confrontation may have felt like protection, a way to preserve composure and avoid tension. You believed that by stepping away, you were exercising wisdom and self-control. Yet the mind and the deeper self do not experience resolution in the same way the outward world does. While the external situation concluded, internally there remained unfinished business. What you did not speak, what you withheld, continued to exist in the form of subtle tension, recurring reflection, and quiet questioning. Avoidant regret is the recognition that you abandoned not just a circumstance, but also a part of your own truth. It is not the result of leaving, but of leaving without fully inhabiting your inner voice. The psyche notices what was withheld, and over time it returns to it repeatedly, not to punish, but to guide you toward integration and understanding. This kind of regret is not dramatic or intrusive, but persistent. It manifests as internal questioning, subtle dissatisfaction, or a quiet sense that the ending lacked completeness. The key lies in recognizing the distinction between conscious silence and silence born of avoidance. Silence chosen deliberately with awareness of your feelings and intentions is an act of strength. Silence that arises from fear, discomfort, or the desire to evade tension stores unresolved emotion within the inner self. Avoidant regret signals this stored energy, showing you that the psyche seeks wholeness. Growth emerges when you allow yourself to examine why you remained silent, without harsh judgment or self-recrimination. Understanding your motive restores agency and clarity. The mind no longer needs to replay the moment once comprehension occurs, because the experience has been integrated. In this way, silence regains its dignity and purpose. It becomes a conscious choice reflecting respect for both yourself and the situation, rather than a default reaction to fear. Avoidant regret fades as understanding takes its place, and what once felt like a gap in courage transforms into insight, showing that true inner peace arises not from the absence of conflict, but from alignment between action and inner truth. Leaving becomes an expression of integrity, not a source of division within the self, and the power of deliberate conscious silence is fully realized.